Welcome. Welcome to What Next for the Postcolonial Museum. I'm Amanda Parker, and I will be convening the conversation. So it feels like we've come a long way since 2006 when Neil McGregor said repatriation is yesterday's question. It feels like a long time ago, or does it? Since then, we've had the SAR Savoy focus on France becoming more active in returning their colonial period exhibits, and a whole wealth of reaction to that, both for and against. More recently, ICOM have sharpened the debate around reflecting and reacting to colonial acquisitions, framing the narrative in terms of inequality, narratives, and even staffing, which I think is helpful. So it feels like we're pushing at an open door, or does it? If we are going to discuss what the key challenges and proposed answers are for the post-colonial museum. I thought what we could do is give each speaker 3 minutes to kind of outline what their key changes are in their respective areas. Let me do a quick introduction to the speakers. Let me start with Robert, as he's sitting beside me. Robert Story. Prior to joining the Horniman in South London, his anthropological research has seen him living with nomadic tribes in the Amazon. He has previously been the curator for American collections at the British Museum, and he's currently responsible for the anthropological collection at the Horniman, which is South London. Beside him is Jonathan Fine, who is the curator of the Ethnological Museums in Berlin. I said, but museum, it's actually plural. And this is an area which his museum's group falls under the recently updated national guidelines on dealing with collections from colonial contexts. More to follow. He is the curator for the West Africa, Cameroon, Gabon, and Namibia sections, and is also a speaker for the working group on provenance issues for the museum. Beside Jonathan is Bambi Ceuppens, who is an anthropologist, a senior researcher and curator of the Africa Museum in Belgium. And she curates on the African presence in Belgium, as well as representations in decolonization. She also teaches anthropology at CASC. So to kick off, we thought it would be helpful to hear from each of you on the significant changes in display, narrative, and strategy around colonial acquisition, because you've each got very different approaches. So, starting with the closest.
Hello. Okay, good. I know Bambi said, Amanda said that we would have 3 minutes, but I'd like 3.5.
I knew this would happen.
Thanks. Anyway, as Amanda said, I work at the Horniman Museum. I was the lead curator for the redisplay of the Horniman Museum's anthropology collection. And our World Gallery opened about a year ago, displaying 3,000 objects. So the Horniman is one of the world's most visited community museums. We have nearly 1 million visits a year. Our audience is local. It's maybe only 3% from out of town, 75% regulars, 75% families with young children. And the museum has long established relationships with almost every imaginable community organization and group. And this network provided the extensive consultation process over the 6 years of gallery development. And it included consultation with colleagues around the world who often, well, sometimes were representatives of the communities of the makers and users of the objects in our collections. And the purpose, really, of that consultation was to ensure that the gallery offered a respectful and enabling context for many different narratives and voices. And it was framed by the core question of anthropology, I suppose, which is, what does it mean to be a human and to live a human life? So the new gallery celebrates creativity, imagination, adaptability. We emphasize the qualities of love, compassion, empathy, and we hope that the recognition of shared human experience can evoke understanding, tolerance, curiosity with other ways of being. And its key ambition is to offer decentered, humanizing narratives that oppose othering and dehumanizing. So any one of us, for example, could be a refugee. We try and show that in the gallery. Other peoples and cultures have a right to exist and to their own ways of being and understanding. So my vocation as an anthropologist involves seeking reflexivity, questioning my own assumptions and beliefs, and putting them in dialogue with other ways of being and seeing in the world. And this project really, for me, exposed the wicked complexity of many of the tasks we'd set ourselves. And it kind of laid bare really unanticipated horizons of dissonance and ignorance. And it's forced me to acknowledge really the limits of my own reflexivity and imagination, and really revealed that we can't anticipate our blind spots. So I don't believe the Horniman Museum can be post-colonial. Like most of our institutions, the Horniman was brought into being, immersed in ideologies of hierarchy and exploitation. And colonialism, as we all agree, is not an historical event. It's something that shapes, saturates our contemporary lives. So, I mean, the Windrush scandal, the Brexit divisions, they all kind of show that we remain immersed in a profoundly undecolonized context. So if you think maybe something that I was reflecting on when I was talking to Amanda earlier is that the Colonial project really still resides, I mean, even within my job title, for example, Keeper of Anthropology. So deep within the historical British culture of keepers, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal of England, Wicket Keeper, Keeper of Anthropology, I mean, it moves the same principles of rank and force that were deemed to be aspects of a natural order of things. I mean, it's I hadn't even thought about that until recent years. So such a realization would probably have horrified Frederick Horniman. You see, so although the Horniman is not post-colonial, I mean, and cannot be, I think, it is the inheritor of humanist and minority critical traditions. So Frederick Horniman was a Quaker, nonconformist, pacifist, concerned with social justice, and that founding contradiction really continues to play out recursively. Our attempts to do good, sometimes causing harm, and our attempts to mitigate the harm leading to misunderstanding. And then, if we are humble, I suppose, that can lead to dialogue and then to trust. And I think that trust is the key, because with trust there can be forgiveness. So trust is embedded in genuine, egalitarian relationships that must inevitably take work over the long term. And our first step is to listen and to learn. Perhaps whenever we feel we've got something to say, we should, accept that perhaps not saying might be more appropriate.
Which reminds me of my favourite joke. Your comments about keeper, sorry. I knew my wife was the keeper when I met her. It was the big gloves that gave it away. Just, I like that. I'm going to pick up on a lot of what you said in a minute, because some of what you said touches on the first question to all of the group, but thank you. And Jonathan, if you can introduce just key findings in the last 18 months of
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? First of all, I'd like to thank for the invitation to come here today. It's an incredible pleasure, and it's also an honor. In contrast to the Horniman Museum, the State Museums of Berlin are the heirs to both the German imperial tradition and the Prussian national tradition. We were founded by the Kingdom of Prussia in the 19th century, and we continue on to this day, although the Kingdom of Prussia was dissolved after the Second World War. So we are, in some sense, a national museum without a nation, and enmeshed in the narratives of nationalism and colonialism that shape Prussian history and continue to echo through German history. At the moment, we're closed. The Ethnological Museum of Berlin, like the Asian Art Museum of Berlin, closed 2 years ago in preparation for moving our permanent exhibitions to a new facility called the Humboldt Forum, which is an exhibition facility and a dialogical facility in a reconstruction of the Prussian Royal Palace, which is being built at the heart of Berlin. And I think it's very interesting that at this moment in time, Germany is choosing to rebuild a monument to its imperial and royal past, which in some ways stands in tension with its intentions for the present and the future. The problems about the Humboldt Forum and its presentations, I think, are known if you start Googling. The Humboldt Forum itself has come under tremendous critique, both by historians and post-colonial activists. It's very interesting to be part of a process of critique when the institution itself doesn't yet exist. And I think that means that we as an institution in the Ethnological Museum are hindered in our engagement with the present discussion and the present debates about museums and our responsibility, because we do not have the usual voices that museums have. We do not have exhibitions open, and we're in a process of preparing rather than a process of presenting. That said, I think if people understood what it was that we were attempting to do, they might find it more interesting. I'm not sure they would find it less problematic, but perhaps they would find it easier to engage with. And I can speak a bit about the exhibitions of the African collection, which were planned for the Humboldt Forum, most of which will be opening within the next 2 years. One is, in planning the exhibitions of the African material, we decided to eschew a master narrative. We did not believe that any master narrative made sense in a museum in the 21st century, and that the attempt to create a master narrative was simply to reinscribe the relationships of power that were a problem in the first place. We chose instead to present episodes, to present moments that provide insight into the collections, their past, and their meaning in a way of beginning a critical dialogue. The overarching theme for those episodes, however, was to present African societies, histories, and cultures as part of a global world for thousands of years. Some of the earliest pieces in our collection are Chinese porcelains, which were acquired during the German colonial period from East Africa, and are material evidence and material carriers of the connection of the African continent to Asia, to China, to Indonesia, through the trade routes that connected the continents together before the era of European expansion. The process, however, of creating these exhibitions is one that I do not think would stand the criticism of today's debate. German curatorial practices 10 years ago, when the project started to be conceived, were not consultative. They were not based in outreach and co-curatorial strategies with colleagues both in Africa and within the African diaspora in Berlin. They were very one-sided and rooted in a German culture of expertise, which is itself a problem. And one of the things that I and my colleagues have tried to do over the last 3, 4, 5 years since we've been there is to deconstruct that notion of authority and expertise and to find opportunities to co-curate spaces even when those opportunities have been very limited. The problem of co-curating and experimenting was recognized quite early on by our foundation's president. The State Museums of Berlin are part of the Foundation of Prussian Cultural Heritage, the president of which is Professor Hermann Partzinger, who received money from the Federal Foundation for German Culture to do experiments. That was called the Humboldt Lab. It was a fascinating process in which curators and people from outside the museum could propose projects to develop, which were supposed to flow into the process of planning the Humboldt Forum. It resulted in experiments that range from multisensorial immersions into a beauty parlor in Lamu, to experiments with different kinds of vases and different kinds of clay carrying vessels. However, there is one thing that I think makes the German context different from many other contexts, and that is that German institutions are used to dealing with the past. World War II and the Holocaust have meant that German institutions have confronted very difficult pasts. And in an ironic way, the well-trodden paths for dealing with the past that the Holocaust and World War II have given German institutions, threaten now to provide a model for dealing with the colonial past. Why do I say threaten, and then I'll leave it? Threaten because the answers to the problem of decolonizing, of unthinking structures of power, are not present in the Holocaust, because the problems of cultures colliding under unequal conditions was not the central problem of the Holocaust and World War II. The Holocaust and World War II were largely European problems that took place inside a European context. How you begin to confront the much more complicated problems of understanding unequal power relations during the period of European expansion requires a more open frame of mind.
Two very, very contrasting views already. Bambi Ceuppens.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Is it okay? I didn't time my talk, Amanda, so if I'm talking too long, you just give me a sign and I'll shut up. So I've been working in the Royal Museum for Central Africa, which is still the official name, since 2007. And between 2007 to 2015, I was a member of the steering committee that had the task to create a storyline for the new permanent exhibition. And then after an external assessment in 2015, the structure was changed. And so then I became one of the two general curators of the permanent exhibition. My responsibility is for the humanities and the social sciences. So I want to say that because my role as general curator should not be overestimated, obviously. The permanent exhibition, the new permanent exhibition, is not my exhibition, it's not my personal exhibition, it's not an author's exhibition, it's an institutional exhibition. And obviously, the creation, the development of the exhibition was a long time underway by the time that I became one of the general curators. And it is not as if I then could simply sweep everything that had been done before from the table. The Royal Museum for Central Africa, a few preliminary remarks. It is a federal research institute. It's also a museum. It's one of the last former colonial museums that has both cultural and natural history collections, and it's also an institute for overseas development cooperation. It has the largest collections from Central Africa in the world, and it was founded by Leopold II in 1897 as a tool for colonial propaganda. Started out as a temporary exhibition, which was extremely popular, arguably still the most visited exhibition in Belgian history. I think about 1 million visitors at a time, when there was only a small bourgeoisie and hardly any public transport. And one of the major attractions of that exhibition was a display of 7 reconstructions of Congolese villages, where 267 Congolese were forced to act out scenes of everyday life. 7 of them died and are buried in front of the church in Tervuren. And then in 1958, the last World Exhibition took place in Belgium, and then the colonial section did not take place in Tervuren, but in Brussels. But the colonial subjects were lodged in Tervuren on the museum side, so that they would not fall for the temptations in the bright city where they were working over day. 1958 was also the last major overhaul of the permanent exhibition. 2 years later, in 1960, Congo became independent. The museum lost its raison d'etre and a lot of money too, since it could no longer be used as an instrument of colonial propaganda. And so it gained a reputation of being the last colonial museum in the world, which, if you look at the images throughout time, does not mean that the permanent exhibition never changed. but that it did retain a very colonial perspective on Africa until its closure on the 1st of December in 2013. When you went into the museum, a lot of visitors considered it a bit like mosques in the tropical forest. In reality, there are no mosques in the tropical forest, only in the savannah. But the idea that what you saw was basically an ahistorical perspective on African cultures, as if colonialism as such had never taken place. So you saw the impact of colonialism. So in a sense, what you saw in that colonial and post-colonial museum were not colonial societies, but pre-colonial societies. And then obviously all the stuffed animals. So really this juxtaposition, say, between human life, which was very similar in a sense to animal life, and then obviously no critical stance towards the person who created the museum and the physical and symbolic violence that characterized Leopold II's and subsequently Belgium's colonialism of Congo. The museum is also a protected monument, not only on the outside, but on the inside as well. And so there are very problematic objects in the museum, like, for instance, 2 plaques that commemorate the 1,500 Belgian men who lost their lives in Congo between 1876 and 1908, and no mention at all of the hundreds of thousands or millions of Congolese who lost their lives there during that same period.
Okay. That is a great place, if you don't mind, for us to kick off, because what I hear from the 3 of you, both explicit and implied, is, if not amelioration, outright discomfort with where we are in the narrative. So I kind of want to start with, are we having the right conversation in the first place? When I took this on, I felt surely we've had the conversation about restitution and reparation and the giving back, but I think we should backpedal and start there and say, can there be such a thing as a post-colonial museum? Is there such a thing when your very being is so steeped in bloodshed, theft, upset, or acquisition by any other means? Can we have a post-colonial museum?
Yeah. I mean, I think we could imagine a post-colonial museum that was still within a not yet decolonized context, perhaps through radical decentering, genuinely sharing, actively confronting inequality. We don't have it yet, and I hope we will arrive at a post-colonial moment, but that's also going to be a moment which is post-racist, post-hierarchy, post-exploitation, and it seems to me that that demands, such a profound systemic shift in our own societies. I mean, that may be coming, but the idea that it would belong to a very different but not impossible world, I think.
I think one of the strange things for me taking part in the debate that's happening in Germany now is seeing that because the German past in the 20th century erased much of the German colonial past from present consciousness, that one of the few places where the colonial past has remained visible is in institutions like mine, ethnological museums or museums for the art of countries or cultures that are not within Europe. And so a misunderstanding, I think, has arisen that decolonization takes place through museums. And I realize that I'm going a little bit out on a limb here. And the extension of that is that the way to decolonize is to decolonize museums. And I think our institutions, and I will just hazard this a little bit, are symptomatic of processes that have not yet taken place, rather than the key places in which those processes must take place. And of course, decolonization must take place in museums. Don't misunderstand me. But I think it is a misapprehension to think that if you decolonize the museums, you have decolonized culture, state, people's expectations. And so I think the discussion must be broadened. And I think all of us who've done research about the colonial past, as well as the implications for the still not really decolonized present, realize that there are government agencies, there are private agents and actors who have taken part in colonial history and continue to shape the present, and that until we come to grips with systems of inequality and the afterlife of colonial institutions and assumptions in the present, we will not be able to decolonize our museum. So I think I disagree with you that,
So Robert posits a kind of post-racist future.
I mean, it's a utopian imagined future,
right?
Yes, quite.
and Jonathan, you've kind of highlighted that museums shouldn't be held as the sole paradigm of the faults in society. Bambi, let me take that even further. Should museums have colonial collections? Should your museum exist?
Well, obviously, the museum should not exist. Obviously, colonialism should never have taken place. But the museum does exist, and there was colonialism, and we are still dealing with the aftermath. So we can't erase that past, no matter how problematic we consider it. I completely agree with what Jonathan says, because the debate on post-colonialism or decolonizing the museum hadn't even started when we started the renovation of the museum. And once we reopened, a lot of critics, including the experts of African descent with whom we had collaborated throughout the process and who had never talked about that before, said, well, you should never have tried to change the exhibitions that you already had. You should have transformed the museum into a museum about the history of Belgian colonialism. So in that sense, what people want indeed is a kind of an official monument towards the colonial past, rather than a museum that talks about its own, the research that is being done behind the scenes, and also, indeed, the colonial history that created it. And I think, indeed, that is actually a quite lazy and convenient way for society as a whole to deal with the colonial past. That's the museum in Tervuren that has to do that, and the rest of society is not concerned at all. But that is a major challenge, and I think now, for the years to come, I mean, this is something that we have to deal with. For me, it's even if we were to transform ourselves into a museum of the colonial past, how could we do that without actually the presence of objects and testimonies from and about Africans that can show precisely that these were people just like us who were dehumanized? Otherwise, it would be basically a museum, again, about European agency towards Africans without any Africans' presence. And so I think that is a very important debate that we need to have now in Belgian society.
So it's quite understandable, isn't it, when you can really appreciate why people fix on the museum as the centerpiece for the ills of colonialism, and you've raised a lot of issues about the problems with that. So I really want to ask then, if museums are in the middle of a kind of identity crisis, in a sense, which is being pushed their way by others, not necessarily because of what they're doing, I want to ask, what should they be then? I mean, very, very briefly, if they're not that, what should they be? If they shouldn't be a repository for narratives around how that country has acquired or done whatever they've done, what should it be? What should your museum be?
Well, because a museum
should
be anything.
Should it even have things in it? Should it even have objects?
Well, it might be that, you know, you say, well, we have these buildings, we have these collections, and we have these ambitions, and it's not necessarily the best place to do that, but it is the last place. And that is why we do it there, because of the kind of foreclosing of shared, safe, emotionally safe spaces where people can gather and experience difference in terms of hospitality, giving and receiving hospitality, being curious in ways that are not threatened and not threatening, a sense of mutual respect in a common environment where you can, begin to have those discussions. And that idea of that providing these places that are emotionally safe, that are shared, that are authoritative, that are public. I think that's the kind of, if we have a high-level vision about what it is we're trying to do, that is what we're trying to do. The fact that we have these buildings and these collections and this history of doing it in a particular way might have to be, constantly readdressed.
Yes.
And you may finally have to resign that ambition or move somewhere else to do it. But that is where we wish to go, and that is our reason for doing it. We're the last place that we can do this.
I want to say I subscribe entirely to Bambi's position. My museum should not exist. I think we're very clear on that. But colonialism existed, and so we do exist. And I think one of the challenges that we face is that the need to address that past and its presence in the present and in the future remains central. But that is a need that is primarily of Germans, by Germans, for Germans, as diverse as Germany is. In other words, the need to confront the colonial past is a need that different sectors of German society are now bringing to us and talking about with us. That may be very different from the needs, desires, or interests of people in the countries where many of the objects come from. And indeed, they may be, in some ways, quite radically at odds with the need of German institutions and German groups to work through the colonial past.
I'd like to pick up on that and take that to you, Bambi. Is there a tension between the communities that you serve? I mean, all museums aim to involve community participation in what they do. Can you tell us a bit about the tension between the community as experienced by the immediate Belgian community, and the communities with which you work with, who are the communities from where original artifacts came from?
Yes, but then there are also there are the African diasporas in Belgium, but then obviously there are also people in Africa themselves. And so certainly when we are talking about restoration, I think it's important to get both groups involved. And then you see that they do not necessarily agree. That certainly in Belgium there are a lot of activists who are very radical and say all the objects should be sent back, or at least they should become the property of the original owners, which begs the question, who are the original owners? Should they be transferred to the national museums in Congo, for instance? Should they be transferred to communities, to ethnic groups, etc.? So that's already, but that's something that a lot of activists have no interest in. They shouldn't be here, they should go back. Whereas there are other Africans in Belgium who say, wait a minute, we are also of African descent, we live here, we want to be able to transmit our history and our culture to our children and their children, so we want these objects to remain here, or at least part of the objects to remain here, because we also have a stake in them. And then there are the Africans on the continent, and I can only talk about what's happening in Congo, but certainly in Congo, I do not have the impression that people are really waiting for the objects to return immediately, because they right now, and first of all, the Belgian state has not received a demand for restitution since the 1970s, at which stage some 160 objects were restituted. So there is no demand, but anyway, the people who are working in the national museums in Congo at the moment, they have just built their own museum, which is now their priority. It was built by the South Koreans, and they forgot to build actually a depot for all the collections. So, I mean, the last thing that they want right now is 300,000 objects coming from Belgium, because they do not even have sufficient room to put their own objects in. So, I mean, it's a very complicated issue, and that often gets lost in public debates. And then it also depends indeed upon very particular contexts, whether there are historical contexts, such as the differences between German and Belgian and British colonialism, or indeed the composition of the diasporas living in those different countries, and then obviously also in relation to the home countries where these objects came from.
So how do you square all of those tensions?
I
mean, that's to all of you, really.
Obviously, well, you cannot square them, really. I mean, it's an ongoing debate, and as I said before, the debate moves so incredibly fast. We reopened in December of last year, and it's only after the publication of the report by Savoy and Sarre a few months later that all of a sudden everybody in Belgium was talking about restitution, whereas previously no one had talked about it. The issue was never addressed during the 10 years that I've been working on the renovation. And so that is, I think, one of the major challenges for museums, and specifically for those with permanent exhibitions. How do you actually try to keep up with the speed with which public debate evolves?
Well, let's drill into that, because there are going to be lots of questions, I know, and there's lots of things that I kind of want to jump in and go, yes, and but. I mean, Felwine Starr talked about decolonising the gaze. Some of the stuff you've touched on actually brings that to the surface, that there is a real difficulty with decolonising the gaze. Even when you bring in the communities who are affected and influenced by that, you've got a kind of subset of people who are here, people who are other, etc., and who are you talking to within that. I kind of want to push it further, actually, and say, when you talk about communities, when you talk about working with communities, how does staffing and the people working in the museum influence that? Coming off the back of your point about it's a very recent conversation that people have been saying this needs to happen now. That's very recent compared to the time you've spent in building up to the point where you are now. How would staffing affect and influence that? I want to start with you, Robert, because I know personally your museum, so I understand the demographic of the neighbourhood. I don't know the demographic of the museum. Is there a role to play in widening who's working in the museum, and how and whether would that affect what happens to the collections? Complicated, long question.
I mean, it is why I described the tasks we set ourselves as wickedly complex, in the sense that they are wicked problems, that imagined or actively sought solutions to any one problem provokes other problems or makes the environment worse. So
the diversity of a workplace.
So diversity of a workplace seems to would be a crucial indicator that there was progress, that the institution was capable of the sorts of radical transformations that we're all calling for. That is not happening, and it is to do with the institutional, and in the very broadest sense, structures which channel people into working in a museum like the Horniman. And I suppose one of the first steps towards it is an active addressing of Southeast London schools and school children, with a particular focus on providing mentorship and imagining and collaborating on creating the pathways to that. But I have a sense of dissatisfaction with that idea, not least because...
Glad you got there.
Yeah, not least because it involves channeling people into the existing structures and saying, well, they didn't access these structures because of choices that were made age 10, 11, 12.
Yes.
So what we can do is we can intervene age 10, 11, 12 and encourage them to think about that future.
So
whereas the problem is that the structures are incapable of delivering the sort of transformation that we want, which means that the structures are the problem.
Okay, so how can we make the Horniman, specifically, and I do mean widening to you guys as well, how can you make your museums more aligned with the needs of the future in terms of the colonial past through changing the workforce? How can you specifically do that? What do you guys need to do? I feel that's a bit accusatory. I don't mean it to be.
No. So because this is a very live debate, because it involves, being asked to imagine something we haven't imagined before, and part of that is certainly collaboratively looking at the ways in which what you need a job or a role to do needs to be reimagined in terms of the capabilities and the skills that will move that role forward, which is not framed in terms of a pathway that got there. And there has been a just beginning, but impressive amount of work in the way that skills are redescribed in ways which don't place obstacles, which are about formal pathways to that route. And I've seen a number of appointments, both at the Museum of London and we're just beginning that process too, working with the kinds of work they've been doing at the Museum of London to really open up the applicants to jobs, because they don't say you must have a master's or you must have a PhD. They just think from the beginning, we need people who do these sorts of things together. And I think it's tiny baby steps, but that's a real, genuine and effective intervention.
Yes.
I would say German institutions have two problems. One is that there aren't large communities from the diaspora in Germany today. Of course, there are Afro-German communities and communities from Asia and communities from Oceania, but compared to France, to Belgium, and to the UK, they're much smaller. And the second problem is, perhaps it's not a problem, is that because of the way that the German colonial empire came to an end in 1918, most people who would have a historic connection to the collections today have grown up in countries where German was actively discouraged as a language. And so there's an immediate language barrier that doesn't exist in many other European countries. One exception is Namibia, and that's not surprisingly one of the areas in which we have the most active collaborations going on at the moment. But that immediately means that you need to rethink what it is that a museum can do as a custodial entity and as an exhibition entity and an entity aimed at developing discursive spaces, as the new ICOM definition recommends. And that is that I think we need to think of ourselves as creating an infrastructure with which conversations, or inside which conversations can take place, less as providing custodial expertise or determining a path for the institution. And so some of the most interesting engagements that have taken place for me over the last year are where people involved in different projects that the museum is running come together and begin to exchange insights, information, views, perspectives, really without Germans and German people mediating. So there's quite an extraordinary exchange that took place between colleagues from Namibia and colleagues, Native American colleagues from Omaha over the last 6 months, where they talked about what it meant to lose your language. And that was something that the Germans in the room and that I in the room had very little to contribute to, but would be fascinating to give to a wider audience and to present. And I think our potential will lie in facilitating those conversations and making ourselves a public platform for those things to happen.
Is partnership the right approach, Bambi?
Certainly, because I think engaging more people from an African background is just one way to change the perspective, and it is absolutely crucial. But there are a lot of constraints, political, economic, financial, so what can you do in the meantime? And then I think that perhaps the way forward is to actually basically constitute your policies regarding curating, collecting, your charter, your ethical criteria, etc., that you basically do that in close collaboration, so basically co-creation with people of African descent and with Africans on the African continent, so that So in a sense, you could say it is a top-down approach, in the sense that it's with those people that you then create the policies, but that should then have its impact upon what happens from the bottom up as well, because obviously you would imagine that one of the first recommendations would precisely be that you need to diversify your workforce. Yes. So I really think that in the short term, that's the only way that you can come towards a solution in the longer run, hopefully.
The observation isn't lost on me on the ethnic diversity of the room and where we are, and not least my not ethnically diverse microphone, just saying. But I want you guys to think about what we should be doing in the future. In particular, I mention the audience because we're obviously in a museums association talking about museums to museums, and I'd like you guys to reflect on what are the key messages we need to take beyond museums to make the change that needs to be happening happen. So while we think about that, I'm sure there are lots of questions in the room. If you can throw up your hands if you have a question, and the handy microphones will come round. We've got starter for 10.
My name's Ceuppens. I'm actually from the Brighton and Hove Black History Project, and we're doing work with Brighton and Hove History. We were brought in by them, and I was really interested by this because we're actually doing work with Botswana, the Botswana Museum, and that's how I've come along. And I have to admit, it was like being back at university with all this language. So, and the question I've got is, you talked about the bringing in of communities. We were brought in for that very reason because we're quite a diverse group. We're a mixture of African, Caribbean, I'm of Asian Jewish descent. And it was, what about their representation? Because we're just ordinary people. I happen to have an academic background, but a lot of the people that have become involved are not academic, and the language used in here is terribly academic, and that does frighten a lot of people away. And I've seen that happen. So it's people, a lot of people, BME people, do not want to come to the museums for that very reason, yet they do like the museums. And that is something that I have seen. You know, when I say to a lot of people, come into the museum, volunteer, this is something that you can work with, especially about some of the exhibitions we have or haven't got. What can be done about that?
So the question is, how do you demystify the language around curation and what museums
Absolutely.
are doing? So can I kick off with Jonathan for that one?
Oh.
Why not?
I think the first thing one has to do is talk. And I think the first thing one has to do is engage in dialogical talk. And by that I mean bring people in and start a conversation.
It needs to be in language that can be understood.
And I apologize if I'm still, but I think starting a conversation is the best way to do that, because misunderstandings abound, and you don't really know what you're misunderstanding or what someone's misunderstanding about what you've said until you really start to talk with them. And so I think really in that sense, the ICOM definition gets to the heart of a matter. It's written somewhat academically, but I think in the way that it demands that museums become places to talk, it's absolutely central.
Yes. I think that is a really interesting and useful point to reflect on, actually, that the movement away from being a place of artifact to a place of conversation also means that the language itself has to change and what's in the space has to change. I mean, I've got it up my sleeve, but I may as well bring it out now. I haven't asked you, we've discussed in the past, there are partnerships happening where programs of exchange and sharing are becoming more prevalent. If there are countries that cannot hold the exhibits that currently live elsewhere, how about a model where we pay to hold them? So the reverse of a library, at the moment, we're kind of going, yeah, you can loan this as long as we can have it back, and you can share this as long as we can have it back. How about Western museums actually pay the countries of origin a kind of holding fee? What do you think of that? Audience seems to like it.
I mean, I'm uncomfortable with the idea of countries that are not ready to receive it. I mean, are you saying that these are countries or groups or communities that don't want things?
I'm thinking about what Bambi said, where the Congolese government may not be in a position to store artifacts that are returned to them, but still will eventually recognise that they are belonging to their communities. So they may not ever get it back, but you may have to pay a fee to hold them. Just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything should be on the table, and I'm certainly not. I wouldn't. I don't think once you have decided that there is an ethical imperative to return things, that it is up to us to decide whether or not they have the capacity to receive them.
Okay.
So that, and I think that setting that sphere of argument off to one side is immoral. I think it needs to be part of the whole range of things that are equally part of a discussion about sharing. And if a thing should not be here, and it should be there because we strongly feel that for all kinds of reasons, then it should not, it is an untrammeled return. It must be. We can't say you can have it back when you've built a place to keep it. If they say we'd like it back and we'd like to build a place to keep it, then of course we should help them do that. I'm not sure about a kind of, then there are other discussions where you would say, and it would be great if we could keep some of this stuff, and what kind of arrangement could we have for that? Yes. Because we would still like to do work with it. But you can't ever have conditions on an object that you have concluded ethically and morally must be returned. Yes. So I think it's not so much about coughing up a fee to not return it. It's about having return on the table as amongst part of the entire conversation. And if that involves support and help with infrastructure in order to make it happen, then obviously that is also part of the conversation and needs to be.
We can single-handedly bankrupt the whole of the Western Museum.
All too easily.
Here,
yes, it would take just a moment.
Restitution is fundamentally not about sending objects back, it's about changing ownership. And you can do that immediately. I mean, the objects can change where they are, but they do no longer belong to European museums or states. They belong to the rightful proprietors. So that is something that you already can do. And then they can decide which objects they want back immediately, which they want back on the long term, which ones they want to be in other museums, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But certainly I know that in Congo there is a demand for something else. And that is exposure also to European art. We all know that African art in general and Congolese art in particular had a huge impact upon European modernism. If you live in Congo, you've never seen a painting by Picasso in your life because there are no museums. So what they are also asking for is precisely an exchange. So, okay, you can perhaps keep some of all our objects, but in return we want to have access to your objects as well. Because basically now if you want to see art collections from all over the world, you have to come to Europe or to the Americas and to some Asian countries, but there is not a single African country indeed where you have access to all these different kind of cultures. And so that's important as well. And for me, that has to be part of the conversation. So simply saying we'll just send everything back, I mean, that's not what we should be talking about at all, I think.
And I think
I've been given my tea for time out, so hold that thought. Are there any other questions? Because I don't want to leave people. Yes, there is one at the front, down here. Keep your hand up so they can see you. Thank you. Sorry, hold that thought. Come on.
Hi, Matt Story from Middlesbrough Museum Service. conversation touched briefly on the decolonisation in a wider context and beyond museums. We have an example yesterday. There was lots of press around the British High Commission in New Zealand meeting with Maori communities to express regret.
Yes, say sorry, sorry.
Well, they didn't say sorry.
Sorry.
I think that's the point. And my question really is about how would decolonised museums help the process for nations to go as far as apologising, or actually do we need governments to take responsibility for their colonial past before we can actually truly decolonise the museums within our countries?
Well, I think one of the differences between perhaps museums in the UK and museums on the continent is that we are governmental institutions. The carrier of my museum is the federal government of Germany and the governments of the individual states. So I think the question that you raised and the answer that you gave goes quite centrally to the point, and to the matter of what do European states, European countries, European cultures owe to formerly colonized territories, regions, countries, and peoples. And I think the answer to that has to be something quite significant. We owe a great deal. The answer, however, has to be that on some level, museums are being used as a symbolic token in a much broader, much deeper, and much more important discussion. We are being instrumentalized kind of as placeholders in that discussion about what do European states owe to formerly colonized peoples and countries. And the answer has to be that we must own up to our responsibility in our institutions and behave as ethically as we know how with as diverse museum staffs as we can gather to reach these questions, but that doesn't and cannot get our carriers out of their responsibility to also own up to their role in world historical processes and to apologize for the past where that's needed.
I think, I mean, the weight of this conversation shows that we could spend a good few hours, days. Let's carry on in the bar, as they say. Thank you all very much for what I feel like is a touching the surface, but a very deep and important conversation to have. Thank you, audience, for being so engaged, and let's meet at the bar.